On the left side of the screen, the violent, muddy trench warfare of 1914. On the right, a pristine university boardroom in 2026 where executives mandate ideological compliance. Your high school history books lied to you by omission. The Cold War never actually ended. It simply took off its uniform, put on a tweed jacket, and moved into the lecture halls. The most successful revolution in human history was never televised. It was peer-reviewed.
I need you to understand a deeply uncomfortable paradox. You likely believe your political opinions, your cultural outrage, and your moral compass are uniquely your own. You are spectacularly wrong. Your modern worldview was meticulously engineered by a small group of exiled German philosophers nearly a century ago. Ignorance of this intellectual architecture leaves you as nothing more than a predictable biological puppet, moving blindly in a high-stakes game you do not even realize you are playing. But today I am going to hand you the decrypted source code of the modern culture war. By adopting the analytical lens of a sociological hacker, you will suddenly see the invisible mathematical framework governing our reality. You will recognize the exact same algorithms dictating everything from the scripts of your favorite Netflix shows to the admission policies of the Ivy League. You are about to step outside the matrix of modern academia, and once you see the code, you can never unsee it. We stand in an empty, echoing lecture hall before a massive blank chalkboard. I take a piece of white chalk and draw a single, bold line. At the top, the name Karl Marx. At the bottom, I place a glowing smartphone displaying a viral campus protest from 2026. The space between them is not empty. As we pan across the slate, a terrifyingly complex web of academic citations reveals itself, connecting obscure sociological texts directly to the modern corporate logos dominating your screen. To understand this invisible web, we must trace the chalk line back to a specific room in Germany. The year is 1923. A symposium known as the First Marxist Work Week has convened, but the mood is absolutely funeral. These brilliant intellectuals face a brutal mathematical reality that shatters their foundational texts. The grand, inevitable socialist revolution, predicted by orthodox Marxism, has spectacularly, undeniably failed to materialize. The math of historical materialism is broken. According to the classical economic theory written in the 19th century, the working classes of the world should have inevitably united against their capitalist bosses. It was supposed to be a scientific certainty. Instead, when the summer of 1914 arrived, those same workers eagerly put on their national military uniforms. They marched into the trenches and enthusiastically slaughtered each other across the muddy fields of Europe. The proletariat chose the flag over the factory. This bloody betrayal in the trenches of World War I was an intellectual catastrophe for the radical left. The greatest minds of a generation watched their infallible economic prophecies burn to ash in the artillery fire of the Somme. Why did the oppressed fiercely defend the very empires that oppressed them? This was the ultimate anomaly, a glaring glitch in the sociological matrix. They realized their fundamental equation contained a catastrophic error regarding basic human nature. Sitting in that 1923 symposium, the intellectual elite confronted a terrifying truth. They realized that pure economics alone does not drive human behavior. The human operating system is far more complex. They discovered that abstract concepts like culture, religion, and deep-seated family bonds create a massive gravitational well. This cultural gravity was infinitely stronger than the supposed global solidarity of the working class.
The old software was entirely obsolete.
You cannot simply show a man his economic disadvantage and expect him to burn down his church, abandon his family, and overthrow his nation. The invisible threads of Western tradition acted as a psychological immune system against economic rebellion. The Marxist scholars realized they were fighting a war with the wrong weapons. You cannot defeat a cultural fortress using only an economic battering ram. The strategy had to evolve, and the entire battlefield had to be relocated to the mind. To achieve their utopian vision, these architects of thought concluded they had to completely abandon the factory floor. The blue-collar worker was a lost cause, too sedated by patriotism and family life. Instead, they needed to target the very mechanisms of human psychology. If they wanted to dismantle the capitalist machine, they first had to hack the culture that sustained it. They were no longer economists. They were about to become the world's first true psychological warfare engineers. This is the exact moment the strategy shifted. The weapons were no longer rifles and barricades, but syllabuses, cinematic critiques, and sociological papers. They understood that if you can subtly rewrite the moral code of a society, you never need to fire a single bullet. You simply wait for the infected generation to grow up and hand you the keys to the civilization. They were drafting a cognitive virus designed to bypass the intellectual immune system of the entire Western world. As I trace this chalk line further down the board, connecting 1920s Germany to the frantic algorithms of your 2026 social media feed, the sheer scale of their ambition becomes terrifyingly clear. They did not want to merely change who owned the wealth. They wanted to fundamentally alter how you perceive reality itself. They wanted to deconstruct the words you use, the art you consume, and the very concept of normal. And the most shocking part is that it actually worked. But to understand how they achieved this invisible conquest, we have to look at the massive crater left in the wake of their initial failure. We are used to thinking of history as a series of successful conquests, but tomorrow's reality was born from a spectacular defeat. We must examine the profound anomaly that forced these brilliant radical minds back to the drawing board in the first place. We have to confront the grand illusion of the 19th century. Look closely at the historical record. Every variable was perfectly aligned for the global collapse of capitalism. The inequality was staggering, the working conditions were brutal, and the philosophical groundwork was fully distributed across Europe. Yet, when the spark was finally struck, the dynamite simply refused to detonate. The workers picked up their rifles, but they pointed them at each other instead of their masters. It is the ultimate historical cold case. This leaves us staring at the paradox of the missing revolution. It is the single question that birthed the modern culture war. Why did the most powerful, mathematically precise economic theory of the 19th century completely fail to predict the behavior of the 20th century working class? How did a theory that promised to liberate humanity end up fundamentally misunderstanding the human soul? To find the answer, we must open the doors of the Institute for Social Research. To understand this spectacular failure of the 19th century revolution, you have to abandon everything your history teachers told you about political warfare. We are used to thinking that empires are overthrown with gunpowder and barricades, but the reality is far more clinical. Deep inside a university archive, where the air is strictly climate-controlled to a cold 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the true source code of our modern cultural collapse is waiting to be read. Through the eyes of the chief sociologist, standing in the sterile blue light of a microfilm reader,
This is not just an archive. It is a biological weapons lab. Pulling a heavy, leather-bound journal from a dust-free box, the sociologist uncovers a document from the 1920s that completely rewrites the rules of engagement. The text reveals a terrifying, cynical thrill. The chaos you see on the streets today was perfectly choreographed a century ago.
You were programmed to believe that to destroy a capitalist society, you must seize the means of production. You were taught that you must take over the banks, the steel mills, and the energy grids. But the men who wrote this journal realized a profound paradox. Controlling the economy is completely useless if you do not control the mind of the worker. The actual target was never the factory. It was the psychological operating system of the civilization itself. The brilliant, counterintuitive leap made by these scholars was that you do not need to confiscate a nation's wealth if you can successfully seize the means of cultural reproduction. If you can hijack the art, the music, and the morality of a society, the economy will eventually surrender on its own. They understood that the human subconscious is the ultimate battlefield, and they designed a rigorous theoretical framework to completely dominate it. This intellectual laboratory was officially established at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, in 1924. It was known as the Institute for Social Research, though history would later remember it simply as the Frankfurt School. In a supreme stroke of historical irony, this incubator for radical, anti-capitalist thought was entirely bankrolled by a wildly wealthy, disillusioned heir to a massive grain fortune. The revolution was funded by the very system it intended to destroy. Looking closely at the German text under the archive's harsh light, the sociologist sees the exact moment the ideological software was upgraded. The dense economic language of Karl Marx begins to visually dissolve, morphing into a completely different scientific discipline. The factory assembly line is suddenly overlaid with the image of a psychoanalyst's couch. This was their greatest conceptual breakthrough, born from a desperate need to explain their previous political failures.
Key thinkers within the Institute, most notably Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, realized that classical economic theory possessed a massive, fatal blind spot. It had completely ignored the terrifying power of the human subconscious. To solve the paradox of the missing revolution, they decided to execute a theoretical fusion that no one had ever attempted. They aggressively combined the economic determinism of Karl Marx with the psychological manipulation of Sigmund Freud.
This unholy marriage of economics and psychoanalysis birthed an entirely new academic weapon, which they named critical theory. Now, traditional theory is designed to simply observe, understand, and explain the natural reality of the world. But you must understand that critical theory is not an observational tool. It is an active, engineered mechanism of destruction, designed with a singular, unyielding purpose to dismantle the host from the inside out. The explicit function of critical theory is to endlessly critique, dissect, and unmask the underlying power structures of Western society. It operates like an autoimmune disease injected directly into the cultural bloodstream. The goal is not to offer a better alternative, but to relentlessly attack the foundational pillars of the civilization until it inevitably collapses in on itself from the sheer weight of its own manufactured guilt and internal division. To achieve this total systemic collapse, the Institute had to identify the specific psychological prisons that were keeping the Western mind so dangerously stable and compliant. They did not target the government or the police force. Instead, they aimed their analytical artillery at the most intimate aspects of human existence. They targeted the nuclear family,
traditional religious morality, and the classical ideals of Western art. You probably believe that your family structure and your personal morals are a source of strength and individual identity. The professor would tell you that you are hopelessly naive. The Frankfurt School successfully reframed these foundational institutions not as pillars of social stability, but as sophisticated psychological cages. They argued that these traditions were deliberately designed to suppress radical thought and maintain the oppressive status quo. This is the ultimate intellectual hack. By convincing the population that their most cherished cultural institutions are actually tools of oppression, you trick the society into dismantling its own defenses. The sociologist in the archive smiles a cold, cynical smile, holding the literal blueprint for a society's engineered suicide. They proved that if you can rewrite the cultural code, the physical reality of the empire will crumble effortlessly.
But this brilliant, lethal virus was trapped in a highly unstable environment. Just as the Institute perfected its psychological weapon, the geopolitical reality of 1930s Germany began to rapidly deteriorate. The architects of this cultural destruction suddenly found themselves directly in the crosshairs of a terrifying, rising totalitarian regime. To ensure the survival of their ideological code, this intellectual pathogen had to find a new host to infect. To ensure the survival of their ideological code, this intellectual pathogen had to find a new host to infect. We are accustomed to thinking of the 1930s as a geopolitical chess match won by steel and industry, but the official narrative is a myth. As the Institute perfected its new psychological theories, the brutal reality of 1930s Germany forced a dramatic relocation. The virus was about to go airborne. On a sprawling map of the Atlantic Ocean, a stark red line begins to trace a path away from an increasingly dark, authoritarian Europe. This line represents the ultimate Trojan horse maneuver of the 20th century. I want to show you a counterintuitive truth. The rise of a totalitarian regime in Berlin inadvertently seeded the ideological destruction of its greatest democratic enemy. By 1933, the rapid ascent of the Third Reich made Germany incredibly dangerous for the predominantly Jewish scholars of the Frankfurt School. They were brilliant, radical, and marked for death by a regime that demanded absolute biological and ideological purity. They had to flee, packing up their revolutionary theories while their peers were being thrown into the camps. It is a profound historical paradox. These exiled thinkers fundamentally despised the capitalist system, yet they were entirely reliant on it for their physical survival. They looked across the ocean toward a nation they viewed as the epitome of vulgar materialism and individualistic greed. They were running toward the very monster they had sworn to deconstruct and destroy. The red line stretches 3,000 miles across the freezing water, landing squarely in Manhattan. The map dissolves into the towering Gothic architecture of Columbia University. The visual shifts to a bustling 1930s New York streetscape, vibrating with capitalist energy and the relentless roar of commerce. The anomaly is now safely inside the gates of the empire. In 1934, in a stroke of historic irony that your textbooks conveniently omit, Columbia University offered these radical anti-capitalist thinkers a permanent home. The ultimate citadel of American capitalism opened its doors to the architects of its own eventual dismantling. They were given funding, prestige, and completely unhindered access to the young American elite. You were programmed to believe that America historically defeated radical European ideologies through sheer moral and economic superiority. The reality is far more terrifying.
We did not defeat the architects of cultural deconstruction. We gave them tenured professorships in the Ivy League. The ideological pathogen was now incubating in the most secure academic laboratory on Earth. They arrived in a country they deeply, profoundly despised. Stepping onto the streets of New York, they were surrounded by a booming middle class, relentless consumer optimism, and a deeply ingrained sense of American individualism. To the average observer, this was the pinnacle of human progress. To the exiled sociologists, it was a waking nightmare of capitalist compliance. You might assume that witnessing the freedom and prosperity of America would change their minds. That is a fundamental misconception. When they looked at the cheerful American worker, they did not see a success story. They saw a tragic victim of total ideological control, completely unaware of their invisible chains. They saw a population suffocated by its own immense comfort. The Frankfurt scholars realized that classical revolutionary tactics would fail here. The American working class was too well-fed, too entertained, and too heavily invested in the system to ever pick up a rifle and storm a factory. Economics alone could not trigger the collapse of this remarkably resilient society. The attack vector had to be changed entirely to bypass their defenses. From the safety of the Ivy League, surrounded by oak-paneled walls, and the elite offspring of American industrialists, they began translating their dense German critiques into a new language. They systematically mapped out the vulnerabilities of the American psyche, treating the culture of their host nation like an enemy cryptographic code waiting to be cracked and exploited. I found their internal memos from this period absolutely chilling. They weren't studying America to understand it. They were studying it to dismantle it. Every radio broadcast, every billboard, every suburban housing development was categorized and analyzed. They were looking for the pressure points in the human subconscious that could bypass the defense mechanisms of a free society. This was the birth of a totally new discipline. They took the raw, aggressive theories of 1923 and weaponized them for a completely different environment. The virus lost its heavy, militant aesthetic and acquired the slick, polished intellectual veneer of high-level academic sociology. It became respectable, profound, and ultimately, utterly devastating. The statistics lie to you when they measure a nation's strength purely by its gross domestic product. The Frankfurt School understood that if you want to bring down a superpower, you do not attack its banks or its military. You attack its sense of reality. You convince the booming middle class that their unprecedented prosperity is actually a horrific, unforgivable moral crime. By the end of the 1930s, the blueprint was complete. They had successfully relocated the engine of the revolution from the factory floor to the mind of the consumer. They stood at their high-rise windows, looking down at the bustling capitalist machine of New York, and realized exactly how to turn the city's greatest economic strengths into a mechanism for mass psychological surrender. Having established their base high above the concrete canyons of New York, these exiled scholars turned their analytical weapons onto the ultimate target, the booming American consumer culture. To the cultural analyst standing in a neon-lit screening room, the post-war economic miracle does not look like a triumph. It looks like the most sophisticated psychological prison ever constructed. The analyst hits a button on the console. The bank of screens showing 1950s commercials, slapstick sitcoms, and upbeat pop performances suddenly slows down. The audio distorts into a heavy mechanical drone. A digital overlay bleeds across the monitors, highlighting the hidden algorithms of behavioral coercion embedded in every smiling housewife and shiny new convertible. You have been taught that the entertainment you consume is a harmless escape from the rigors of daily life. Your high school textbooks framed the post-war cultural explosion as the ultimate victory of the free market, a democratic playground of endless choices. I am here to tell you that this official narrative is a carefully constructed myth designed to keep your eyes firmly closed.
The reality is far more terrifying. That favorite movie you watch to unwind, that hit song you hum on your commute, that burning desire you harbor for a quiet suburban home, these are not organic human desires. They are highly calibrated intellectual weapons deployed directly against your subconscious to prevent your political and spiritual awakening. Theodor Adorno, one of the primary architects of this critical framework, looked at the dazzling lights of Hollywood and the syncopated rhythms of jazz and felt nothing but cold disgust. He famously coined a sterile industrial term to describe this phenomenon: the culture industry. He recognized that American mass culture was fundamentally not art at all. True art, according to the Institute, challenges the viewer, disrupts the status quo, and forces a painful reckoning with reality. But the analyst sees exactly what Adorno saw: a massive, synchronized machine churning out a sophisticated psychological pacifier. The screens in the room flash with synchronized laughter, a manufactured emotion injected directly into the American living room. You probably think you choose your entertainment based on personal taste, but you were programmed to desire exactly what the system produces. The culture industry operates on the principle of standardized repetition disguised as novelty. You are fed the exact same psychological tropes in slightly different packaging, ensuring your brain never has to do the heavy lifting of critical thought. Adorno theorized that capitalism deliberately mass-produces this superficial entertainment to stunt the imagination of the working class. If you are exhausted from a long day of labor, a complex, challenging film is the last thing you want. You want the sitcom. You want the predictable sports broadcast. And that is exactly where the trap snaps shut on your entire consciousness. By providing a constant stream of easily digestible, formulaic pleasure, the system ensures you never develop the mental stamina required to question the fundamental structures of your reality. You are being trained day by day, hour by hour, to fall deeply and passionately in love with your own exploitation. The chains are made of pure dopamine, and you literally beg for more. Look closely at the digital overlay on the analyst's monitors. It points directly to the ultimate tragedy of the 20th century. This means that a happy, comfortable American worker, proudly driving a brand new car off the assembly line and rushing home to watch evening television, is not a success story. According to the theorists, this person is the ultimate victim. They are a victim of total ideological control, wandering completely unaware through a meticulously landscaped psychological terrarium. The genius of the American system was that it did not require secret police or gulags to maintain compliance. It achieved absolute obedience by burying the working class under an avalanche of cheap consumer goods and manufactured leisure. If this realization shatters your perspective, if seeing your own entertainment consumption categorized as a deliberate psychological pacification blows your mind, then hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel right now to make sure you do not miss the rest of this decryption process. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think anyone today is actually immune to this matrix? The analysts in New York mapped this vast network of cultural control, but they faced a new mathematical problem.
If the entire working class was totally pacified by television and suburban comfort, they would never rise up to tear down the system. The grand theory required a completely new biological weapon, a different vanguard to ignite the fires of the coming social collapse. Realizing that the American working class was too well-fed, too comfortable, and entirely too entertained to ever revolt, the architects of this intellectual takeover faced a critical, systemic failure. If the people you want to liberate refuse to drop their remote controls and pick up pitchforks, your revolution stalls. I need you to look at this archival footage of the 1960s. The system required a completely new biological weapon to ignite the fires of the coming social collapse. Watch the black and white film grain of the 1968 convention riots roll across the screen. You were taught this chaos was an organic explosion of youthful rebellion. You were programmed with a comforting myth. I see the stark, typewritten text of a philosophical essay bleeding directly into this footage. The tear gas and the shattered glass are not random at all. They are the physical manifestation of a highly structured, deliberately engineered ideological diagram. We are arriving at the most brilliant linguistic hack of the 20th century. I'm going to show you how the fundamental concept of tolerance was weaponized to destroy free speech. You likely believe tolerance is a neutral virtue, a baseline requirement for a civilized society. But to the minds that designed this cultural matrix, your traditional tolerance was a fatal vulnerability waiting to be exploited. They engineered a paradox so perfectly inverted that censorship became a moral imperative. By the 1960s, a scholar named Herbert Marcuse emerged from the academic shadows to become the undisputed intellectual godfather of the New Left. He looked at the booming post-war economy and accepted a bitter truth. The white American working class was hopelessly conservative. They had mortgages, pensions, and a vested interest in the stability of the state. They were never going to overthrow the very capitalism that was currently buying them a house in the pristine suburbs. The theoretical software required a massive update. If the traditional proletariat had been bought off by the culture industry, Marcuse needed a new revolutionary base. He identified radical university students, marginalized minorities, and third-world revolutionaries as the new vanguard. This newly defined coalition possessed the precise combination of genuine grievance and intellectual malleability required to dismantle the Western system from within. They became the new shock troops of the mind. Understand the genius of this sociological pivot. Marcuse did not need to invent anger. He simply needed to redirect it. By mapping the undeniable historical injustices of the American system, he provided a unifying academic framework for disparate groups of outsiders. He told them that their varied struggles were all symptoms of the exact same disease, traditional Western civilization. The enemy was no longer just the wealthy capitalist factory owner, but the foundational culture itself. In 1965, Marcuse published an essay titled Repressive Tolerance. It operates like malicious code injected directly into the mainframe of democracy. Here, he executed a flawless subversion of logic. He argued that traditional objective tolerance, the kind allowing all voices an equal platform, actually empowers the oppressive establishment. To his mind, treating unequal forces equally only reinforces the dominant power structure. You have to understand how devastatingly effective this argument was. If a society allows both the oppressor and the oppressed to speak freely, Marcuse claimed the oppressor will always win, simply because they control the societal megaphone. Therefore, true freedom could never be achieved through neutral debate.
The classic liberal idea of a marketplace of ideas was declared a fraudulent trap, a system rigged from the start to silence dissent and maintain the wealthy status quo. His solution was a terrifying ideological inversion. He proposed a completely new system, liberating tolerance. This was not tolerance as you know it. This explicitly demanded intolerance toward right-wing movements and absolute tolerance toward radical left-wing movements. The logic was mathematically cold. To cure a historical imbalance, you do not restore equilibrium. You violently tilt the scales in the exact opposite direction until the old structure shatters entirely. Under this new paradigm, silencing your political opponent was no longer viewed as an authoritarian crime. It was elevated to an act of social justice. Shutting down a conservative speaker on a college campus or demanding the resignation of a dissenting professor became a moral imperative. You were not destroying free speech. You were protecting the marginalized from the violence of oppressive ideas. It was the ultimate intellectual alibi for ruthless, uncompromising censorship. Look back at the footage of the 1968 riots playing out on the screen. The students throwing stones at the police line were not just angry. They were philosophically armed. They had been given a highly sophisticated academic justification for their violence. They were practicing liberating tolerance in real time. The streets of Chicago were the laboratory testing grounds for a theory that would eventually conquer the highest echelons of Western institutions. This is the exact moment the operating system of our modern culture was fundamentally rewritten. When you see modern tech corporations deplatforming users or university administrators enforcing strict speech codes today, you are not witnessing a new phenomenon. You are watching the flawless execution of a script written in 1965. They are merely running the Marcuse software update, functioning exactly as the original architects intended decades ago. I challenge you to look at your own social circles. How many people do you know who genuinely believe that some opinions are simply too dangerous to be allowed in the public square? They did not arrive at that conclusion organically. That instinct to silence opposing views was meticulously planted into the cultural groundwater. It is a synthetic reflex, designed by exiled philosophers who realized that true power lies in dictating what is permissible to even think. The terrifying brilliance of this strategy is its absolute camouflage. By wrapping authoritarian censorship in the warm, progressive language of compassion and protection, the architects bypassed the intellectual immune system of a free society. If you declare that your censorship is an act of empathy, the masses will not just accept their gag orders, they will actively police their own neighbors to ensure compliance. The trap was sprung, and no one even heard the mechanism click. But Marcuse and his vanguard eventually hit a wall of state power. You cannot overthrow the most powerful military-industrial complex on Earth just by rioting in the streets and occupying administrative buildings. The tear gas eventually clears, and the students are arrested. The movement realized that a frontal assault on the system was suicidal. To truly win, they had to take off their combat boots, put on a suit, and step quietly into the Human Resources Department. The tear gas of the 1960s eventually dissipated, leaving behind a profound strategic revelation for the radical vanguard. Throwing bricks at heavily armed police battalions was a mathematical failure. You cannot dismantle a nuclear-armed superpower from the outside. The state possesses a monopoly on violence, and the street protest is merely theater. To actually win the war, you have to lose the battle on the street and disappear entirely from the radar of the authorities.
The quiet, oak-paneled lecture halls of the 1970s offer a starkly different reality. Through the analytical lens of the chief sociologist, this space transforms from a center of classical learning into a covert staging ground. The physical architecture remains perfectly intact, the heavy wooden desks, the chalkboards, the stained glass. But watch the time-lapse of the faculty roster. The radicalized student who once hurled Molotovs has returned, holding a powerful doctoral degree. You were taught that the radical movements of the 1960s burned themselves out, defeated by the conservative resurgence of the subsequent decades. You were completely wrong. Losing those street clashes was, in fact, the greatest strategic victory for the disciples of the Frankfurt School. They realized that a visible enemy unites a nation, but an invisible ideology bypasses the societal immune system entirely. They stopped fighting the system and simply became it. This is the paradox of modern power. True dominance is never loud. It does not announce itself with sirens or breaking news broadcasts. It is the silent, bureaucratic hum of a committee meeting, making a minor adjustment to an academic syllabus. The chief sociologist traces this pivot to a specific doctrinal shift formulated by the student leader Rudi Dutschke. He articulated a brilliant, bloodless strategy that would systematically conquer the West without firing a single bullet. Dutschke called this devastating new protocol the Long March Through the Institutions. It was an absolute paradigm shift, moving away from the romanticized, violent revolutions of the past and pivoting toward relentless, bureaucratic subversion. Why waste energy attacking the citadel when you can simply walk through the front door, acquire the keys, and slowly change the locks over the course of 30 years? It was a masterpiece of ideological patience and strategic infiltration. The new directive handed down to the radical vanguard was breathtakingly simple, yet devastatingly effective. Cut your hair, take off the denim jacket, put on a tailored suit, and go get a graduate degree. You do not need to overthrow the government if you are the one writing the policy briefs. Become the human resources director who dictates corporate culture. Become the media editor who filters the news. Become the university dean who decides which ideas are allowed to exist. You have to admire the sheer, chilling scale of this intergenerational strategy. This was not a plan for the next election cycle. It was a blueprint for the next century. The sociologists mapping this timeline understood a fundamental law of cultural gravity. Whoever controls the teachers' colleges and the graduate schools today will automatically control the corporate boardrooms and the federal agencies 20 years later. The math is brutal, and it is entirely inescapable. Look at the time-lapse of our university lecture hall accelerating into the 1990s. The radical professor who secured tenure decades ago is now the department chair. He does not hire based on academic rigor. He hires 5 more like-minded ideologues based on strict political compliance. The intellectual atmosphere visually shifts. The warm pursuit of objective truth freezes into the cold, clinical enforcement of critical theory. The hostile takeover is completely legalized. By avoiding direct political confrontation, this philosophical framework operated exactly like a stealth virus. It successfully bypassed the immune system of traditional American politics. The conservative politicians of the era were busy fighting the Cold War on a global chessboard, completely blind to the fact that their own universities were mass-producing the ideological equivalent of a biological weapon. They were guarding the borders while the cultural water supply was being poisoned. This is why your personal opinions feel so natural to you, even when they are fundamentally synthetic. You grew up swimming in a cultural reservoir that was meticulously treated with these specific philosophical chemicals. The long march through the institutions was so successful precisely because it was so overwhelmingly boring. Nobody writes thriller novels about administrative bloat or curriculum committee meetings, yet that is exactly where the destiny of your civilization was rewritten. Through the cold, cynical gaze of the chief sociologist, the true horror of this strategy reveals itself. The institutions designed to protect Western culture, the universities, the press, the legal system, were hollowed out and weaponized against the very society that built them. The architecture of freedom was repurposed into an apparatus of control. The revolutionaries did not have to burn the books. They simply took over the publishing houses and systematically rewrote the dictionaries.
You still believe that the culture war is a spontaneous reaction to modern events. I need you to drop that comforting illusion right now. Every campus cancellation, every corporate diversity mandate, and every media outrage cycle you see today is the delayed dividend of an investment made in the 1970s. The Frankfurt school disciples planted a forest, knowing they would never live to sit in its shade, but guaranteeing that you would inevitably be lost in its dark woods. The long march was completed with terrifying efficiency. The radical software was successfully installed on the mainframe of Western academia, silently running in the background for decades. But an ideology this potent cannot be contained within the ivy-covered walls of a campus forever. It was only a matter of time before this engineered virus graduated, packed its bags, and leaped from the theoretical confines of the sociology department into the hyper-connected reality of your daily life. You're used to believing that academic theories stay trapped safely behind the ivy-covered walls of a university, but tomorrow brings a terrifying new reality. That engineered cultural virus we discussed didn't just quietly incubate on campus. It actively mutated, grew stronger, and eventually spilled directly into the bloodstream of the global economy. The harvest of that decades-long march is happening right now. The cultural analyst stands perfectly still before a massive, glowing digital flowchart that dominates the darkened room. It maps a highly structured, relentless evolution. Obscure, deeply theoretical academic papers from the 1990s on intersectionality are directly wired into the mandatory corporate compliance policies of 2026. Glowing data streams connect elite campuses straight to Silicon Valley. Look closely at this flowchart and recognize the ultimate paradox of our time. How did a dense, deliberately unreadable sociological framework designed in Weimar Germany become the standard operating procedure for the most powerful technology companies on Earth? The official narrative says capitalism defeated Marxism. The truth is that the theorists simply hacked the capitalists while they were staring at their profit margins. To trace this extraordinary leap, the analyst zooms in on the late 20th century, where the data reveals a radical mutation in the theory. The original Marxist obsession with class oppression was entirely discarded as obsolete technology. Instead, the framework evolved into an intricate, highly adaptable matrix of race, gender, and identity. This brilliant upgrade birthed the modern architecture of intersectionality. You were taught that this shift was a natural progression of civil rights, an organic awakening of human empathy. You were completely wrong. This was a calculated, mathematical upgrade to the ideological software. By fracturing the general population into endlessly subdividing micro-identities, the architects ensured that the societal conflict would become perpetual, self-sustaining, and structurally impossible to resolve. The analyst highlights a cascading red node on the board. Society was no longer viewed as a simplistic struggle between the wealthy and the impoverished. Instead, human beings were mathematically categorized into rigid, inescapable hierarchies of privilege and victimhood. Your individual character and personal achievements were stripped away, replaced by a permanent socio-economic barcode that dictates your institutional power. We are used to the classical idea of equality under the law, but tomorrow brings a completely different, darker mathematics. In this newly engineered reality, your moral worth is inversely proportional to your historical advantage. It is a brilliantly counterintuitive trap. If you try to defend your autonomy, you merely prove your inherent privilege. The intellectual game is rigged so that the ideological house always wins. To mass-produce this newly programmed worldview, the intellectual factory itself had to be violently retooled. The university system underwent a catastrophic transformation. It officially ceased to be an institution designed to rigorously pursue objective truth. Instead, it was successfully reverse-engineered into an industrial-scale engine designed exclusively to produce obedient political activists. The data flowing across the analyst's screen proves the scale of this hostile takeover. By the 2020s, the exponential administrative bloat in higher education wasn't an accident of bureaucracy. It was a deliberate, tactical occupation. Billions of dollars were diverted to fund vast departments of ideological commissars, ensuring strict compliance from every student and professor who dared to speak on campus. But the most devastating phase of this operation wasn't the capture of the university ecosystem. It was the strategic deployment of its products. The graduates of this reprogrammed system did not leave their radical ideology behind in the dormitories. They packed it in their briefcases and carried it directly into the mahogany boardrooms of Wall Street and the sterile, brightly lit algorithm design labs of Silicon Valley. You probably assumed that the ruthless pragmatism of the corporate free market would easily crush these abstract academic theories. You underestimated the virus. The corporate executives, desperate to maintain their public image and utterly terrified of digital social media mobs, simply surrendered. They outsourced their human resources and public relations departments to the very activists who fundamentally despised them. This is where the intellectual horror truly scales up to a global level. The analyst taps the glass, tracking the flow of this ideology directly into lines of machine code. The disciples of this framework are no longer just writing obscure sociology papers. They are actively writing the algorithms that curate your daily reality. They silently dictate what search results you see and what thoughts are permitted to exist. The Trojan horse has successfully delivered its payload into the very central nervous system of modern civilization. The counterintuitive brilliance of this operation is staggering to witness. They leveraged the massive, centralized wealth of American capitalism to fund, distribute, and enforce the exact psychological tools required to dismantle American society from the inside out. It is a masterpiece of ideological warfare. If you still cling to the comforting illusion that you are an independent thinker, you are deeply underestimating the architects. Your spontaneous reactions, your moral outrage, and your corporate values have all been pre-compiled by a sociological system you cannot even see. You are running an operating system that was explicitly designed to crash, and you are blaming the hardware while the true engineers remain perfectly hidden. The digital lines on the analyst's flowchart pulse with a cold, relentless energy, illuminating the vast web of control. The long march through the institutions is definitively over.
The universities have been captured, the corporate giants have been deeply compromised, and the code has been successfully deployed into the phones buzzing in your pockets. The grand social experiment is live, and you are locked inside. The sun sets over these sprawling Silicon Valleys, casting long shadows across the very servers that now house human consciousness. We have watched this cognitive virus migrate from the damp cobblestones of 1920s Germany. It crossed the Atlantic into the ivy-covered brick of academia, and finally bled into the fiber-optic veins of the modern world. The 100-year plan is complete. As your professor in this grand autopsy of Western logic, I've shown you the raw source code of your daily outrage. Tomorrow's reality is not shaped by politicians. It is dictated by the silent, automated enforcement of a philosophy built by exiles merely a century ago. They observed a fractured, bleeding world. They decided that to cure humanity, they first had to shatter our fundamental perception of truth. Look at the sheer, undeniable scale of this invisible victory. Today, over 60% of university administrators enforce ideological frameworks that are direct descendants of the theories forged in Frankfurt over 90 years ago. The academic Trojan horse did not just breach the gates of our civilization. It became the ultimate gatekeeper, ruthlessly deciding what scientific facts and human thoughts are permitted to enter the modern public square. The most profound tragedy of the Frankfurt School is rooted in a brilliant diagnosis. Men like Adorno and Horkheimer correctly identified the deep, isolating alienation of modern mass society. They saw the spiritual emptiness of consumerism and wanted to break those invisible chains. Yet, the sophisticated psychological cure they engineered proved to be a far more lethal poison than the cultural disease they originally sought to eradicate. To dismantle the old power structures, they taught generations of students that objective truth does not actually exist. I need you to grasp the terrifying gravity of this intellectual hack. If truth is merely a social construct, then every human interaction is reduced to a ruthless, cynical power struggle. They successfully dismantled the unifying myths and shared narratives that historically held Western civilization together. This is the ultimate paradox of their century-long intellectual revolution. The radical thinkers who set out to liberate humanity from the psychological prisons of the 20th century ended up designing a vastly stronger cage. You are no longer held captive by factory bosses or traditional morality. You are constrained by a digital algorithm that endlessly dissects your identity into rigid, inescapable hierarchies. We are now living inside the fully realized vision of their utopian social experiment. It is a sterile world where reality itself is endlessly deconstructed and aggressively debated. This leaves the individual completely isolated, hyper-analyzed, and stripped of deep community bonds. Without the anchor of a shared cultural truth, the human mind is left perfectly primed for the next iteration of total ideological control. You look at the fierce political polarization tearing through our streets and screens. You naturally assume that you are witnessing an organic, chaotic cultural civil war. The perspective I am offering you today permanently shatters that comfortable illusion. This friction is not a glitch in the system. It is the system operating exactly as it was mathematically designed to. The chaos is the product of a highly successful mechanism. My final lesson for you is a direct intellectual challenge. You can no longer plead ignorance to the machinery surrounding you. You now know that the vocabulary of modern justice and the algorithms curating your news feed were explicitly designed to subvert your independence. The architects of this culture war conquered the globe without firing a single bullet. They achieved total dominance by simply rewriting your dictionary and hacking your empathy. As we look up from the glowing screens of this digital campus, we face the infinite expanse of the stars above. Against that cosmic backdrop, our earthly ideological battles seem small, yet incredibly dangerous. We are a species capable of decoding the human genome and touching the surface of Mars. Yet, we have allowed a handful of bitter sociologists to completely rewrite our collective operating system. We traded reality for theory. The Invisible Revolution was never televised because it did not need an audience. It only required your quiet, unthinking compliance. But understanding the dark architecture of a prison is the very first step to walking out of its gates. You possess the intellectual capacity to reject the engineered outrage and reclaim the objective truth. The framework only holds power over you as long as you remain a blind participant. The invisible war for the human mind does not end when this screen goes dark. If this investigation has shattered your old worldview and provided a new lens on reality, hit the like button. That is how we confirm our findings. I invite you to subscribe, not just to consume more media, but to actively continue the research with me. Solidify your understanding by leaving your own conclusions in the comments below. The ultimate defense against a hacked culture is a resilient mind that refuses to be programmed. You now hold the decrypted source code of the 20th century. The responsibility for what happens in the 21st rests entirely on your shoulders. Question the dominant narrative, demand objective truth, and never surrender your intellectual sovereignty to the architects of the abyss. Class dismissed.